Hygiene in the American Wild West was probably about what you'd expect: unhygienic. People made their way west across the continent and struggled with harsh weather and rough terrain. Survival was the number one concern, and finding a nice spot to bathe just couldn't be much of a priority. Today we're going to go through 14 examples of hygiene habits during the Wild West. But before we get started, be sure to subscribe to the Time Capsule channel and let me know in the comments below if you could live in the Wild West. Would you do it? Most beds in the Old West were stuffed with hay and straw, and people didn't change them much. This meant you'd probably be sharing your bed with some unwanted roommates. Lice and other bugs they called seam squirrels. Not exactly five-star accommodation. And that's not all. Flies were constantly getting into food and human waste, while mosquitoes had a field day in those poorly insulated buildings. Since window screens weren't really a thing yet, bugs would follow folks from their houses to the outhouse and back, picking up all sorts of nasty stuff along the way. While some people took care of business in the woods, most people had outhouses close to their homes. You know, for safety and convenience. The setup was pretty simple. Dig a hole, build a little wooden structure over it, and when it filled up, cover it and dig a new hole somewhere else. As you can imagine, these places reeked, so people would throw in lime or lye to try to cover up the smell. The outhouses were like bug condos, especially for flies and black widow spiders, which had a nasty habit of biting people at the worst possible moment. And since toilet paper wasn't a thing yet, people had to get creative with leaves, corn cobs, newspapers, or grass. Yeah, it was as uncomfortable as it sounds. Getting clean water was a whole other challenge in the Wild West. Homesteaders would build outhouses that leaked into the ground, contaminating water for everyone downstream. And most people had no clue they were drinking contaminated water. Standing water was no better, since it attracted flies and other insects that would leave waste and excrement behind as they hovered over the water. People tried collecting clean rainwater in cisterns, but dust and dirt would always find its way in. To save water, people would skip washing dishes and clothes, or they'd wash stuff in their used bath water. Speaking of baths, entire families would often reuse the same tub of water over and over again for a week, sometimes even longer. When it came to soap, you had two main options: animal fat or plants, if you bothered with soap at all. Frank Clifford, an associate of Billy the Kid, wrote about how Mexican women use something called soapweed from the yucca plant to wash their hair. Said it left their hair soft and shiny, and he used it himself plenty of times. The other option was soap made from animal fat, but that stuff was harsh and would irritate your skin. Lucky for them, nobody really cared about body odor. It was just considered normal. People actually thought being too clean was dangerous because it opened up your pores to diseases. Some cowboys even used whiskey as shampoo, mixed it with lavender and castor oil, and rinsed it out with rainwater or borax-softened water. Women would usually just brush their hair and curl it with heated pencils. Dust was everywhere out west. When dust storms and strong winds kicked up, they'd send huge clouds of the stuff into homes and everywhere else, making life miserable for both people and their livestock. Sarah Raymond Herndon, who made the trip from Missouri to Montana Territory in the late 1860s, said the dust was almost knee-deep in some places. At night, she noticed the boys in their group had faces so covered in dust you could barely see their features. It took a lot of precious water just to clean their faces. The dust was not just a hygiene issue, but often caused lung problems for livestock and people, especially the young and the elderly. Here's a gross one. Spitting was such a big problem they actually had to make laws against it. Chewing tobacco was incredibly popular back then, and every saloon on the frontier had spittoons or cuspidors up front for tobacco chewers. The spit would usually end up on the floor and get covered with sawdust, which sounds smart, but actually led to people getting pneumonia and tuberculosis. This was especially bad for folks who'd rent floor space in saloons to sleep. They were literally crashing on floors covered in disease-carrying sawdust. It got so bad that some places made spitting illegal. You could get slapped with a $500 fine or a year in jail for spitting in train stations. That was serious money back then. Dental care was pretty basic in the Wild West. And by basic, I mean non-existent. No toothbrushes, toothpaste, or dental floss. Well, if you felt you had to brush, some train stations had a few toothbrushes people could share. And if you needed to floss, you could use your knife. If you got a cavity or a rotten tooth, you just had it pulled. Even though there were actual dentists like Doc Holliday around, oral care professionals were incredibly rare. You'd go to the barbers or blacksmiths who'd yank the tooth out with glorified pliers. They'd give you some whiskey for the pain, and that was about it. So you better hope that tooth comes out with one yank. Disease was a huge problem in the Old West, especially cholera. Since people used the same water for washing clothes, dishes, and drinking, diseases spread fast through camps and settlements. Cholera was particularly nasty and killed both settlers and Native Americans. In the 19th century, a series of cholera outbreaks among the Mormons claimed thousands of lives. They saw it as God testing their faith. The disease spread along the overland trails to Native American communities too, wiping out huge numbers of people. In 1873, at least 8 states and territories had cholera outbreaks. Of course, people started pointing fingers. Like in Dakota Territory, some doctors blamed Russian immigrants for bringing cholera to Yankton, calling them dirty peasants. But really, it was just part of a bigger epidemic hitting everyone. When it came to staying clean, women generally did a better job than men. Though that's not saying much. Cowboys soldiers would spend days on the range without bathing, maybe taking a dip in a river or stream when they could during the hot summer months. But during winter, they just skip bathing altogether. Women would often go to a spring or stream to wash their faces and take a drink in the morning. But being modest and not having much privacy meant they usually didn't do much more than that. But women generally upheld a higher standard of cleanliness compared to men. Additionally, women washed theirs more often, while men usually only had one set of clothes, would wash them whenever they happened to find some water. Some of the Wild West's famous faces rocked some pretty impressive hair. Guys like Wild Bill Hickok and George Armstrong Custer wore their hair long. Custer even used cinnamon oil to make his smell nice. When cowboys made it to town, they'd treat themselves to the works. Haircut, shave, hot bath, clean clothes, home-cooked food, maybe even some fancy hair tonic. Temperatures in the Wild West could get toasty, and we've already touched on how dusty and unhygienic the time was. This makes the fact that long hair was a popular style on men all the more interesting. But by the late 1800s, short hair became the thing, probably as a way to break from old traditions. It's worth mentioning that not everyone in the Old West handled hygiene the same way. Different cultures had their own ways of staying clean. Take shaving, for example. While most Western guys use straight razors, but in 2005, archaeologists found a pair of tweezers at a site in Deadwood. There was a big Chinese community there, and researchers found the Chinese would never shave. Instead, they'd pluck out their hair one by one with tweezers. As we mentioned earlier, spit in saloons was a thing back in the Wild West. Another hygiene habit is the communal towels in saloons. First off, the saloons weren't exactly what you see in movies. They didn't have stools, but they did have rails on the bottom to lean on. And the bars in most saloons had a rail or series of hooks that held towels patrons would use to wash excess beer foam off of their mouths. Hygiene not being much of a priority. The towels weren't washed or changed between uses by different people, so they just passed saliva from one patron to the next and aided in the spread of germs and diseases. Alcohol was the duct tape of the Wild West. It could be used to fix anything. People used whiskey as disinfectant. They poured it over cuts and scrapes to clean wounds. Honestly, this one wasn't too bad. Being a strong alcohol, it could easily knock you out before surgery. It was even serve as fuel in a pinch. But don't think it was anything like the whiskey you'd find today. This stuff could take down the toughest cowboy with ingredients like raw alcohol, burnt sugar, and even chewing tobacco. It earned nicknames like coffee varnish, tarantula juice, red eye, and firewater. Today, a woman's tan can be a wonderfully attractive feature, but during the peak of the Old West, clear and pale skin complexion was the top desire. Despite their own bad hygiene, cowboys wanted women to have flawless, porcelain-like skin, as if they'd never seen sunlight. To meet this impossible standard, women would go to extreme lengths. They covered up as much skin as possible outdoors, even in the summer heat, wearing full dresses, bonnets, and long gloves. On top of that, some of them using bleach to lighten their skin even more. This practice was incredibly dangerous, often leading to burns and permanent scars. So, what do you think? Still up for life in the Wild West? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more.